Thank you very much. So the question I'm asking today is, what financial system does it take to create true value for the most vulnerable while supporting our planet? As pointed out by the UNCCD and others, more than 3.2 billion people depend on the 40% of the world's land that is degraded, with the highest cost borne by those who can least afford it. Indigenous communities, rural households, smallholder farmers, especially youth and women, and especially in Africa. The new UNCCD report, Investing in Land's Future, Financial Needs Assessment for UNCCD, identifies gaps between current investment pathways and the resources needed to effectively implement the Convention. To achieve the targets that address drought, land degradation, and desertification, the required annual investments that are necessary for the next 6 years are estimated to be $355 billion US, while the actual projected investments fall far short of this at $77 billion US. So this reveals a substantial gap of more than $270 billion that needs to be mobilized, with the biggest financing gap in Africa. So how can this gap be filled? The report highlights a number of areas on the financial side. So for example, mobilizing more domestic public finance, including green bonds, green public procurement, green taxes. But also external public finance, for example, from the multilateral development banks. Private commercial sources, perhaps through carbon markets. And private non-commercial sources, for example, philanthropy. Mobilizing more resources, however, requires us to also look beyond the supply side of finances, as the amount of money being made available very much depends on the quality and the quantity of the investment opportunities. Money is set to follow value, after all. So what is necessary for the financial system to create true value for the most vulnerable while supporting our planet? Last week, at the launch of the Global Flagship Initiative for Food Security, panelists discussed the question of what can be achieved for farmers in Africa to get access to land that is not degraded, access to water, access to knowledge, access to seeds, microfinance, etc. These panelists highlighted that this requires integrated solutions, ensuring that money is spent in inclusive ways. It requires not only technical innovations, but also institutional innovations. This requires partnership, 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 as one panelist emphasized, across the entire value chain, across research and development, across international cooperation, across all key actors. And, as was highlighted during this launch, it requires focusing on those approaches that are backed by scientific evidence supporting their cost effectiveness. So while these comments were made in the context of the launch of the Global Flagship Initiative for Food Security, I would like to support and build on those comments also in the context of thinking about how we can make sure financial markets can work in transformative ways for the most vulnerable people and for the environment, and illustrate these using 2 examples from my own work as a scientist. The first example comes from a dryland area in Kenya, where I was part of a research team about a decade ago, working with the Dairy Cooperative and their Savings and Credit Association, SACCO. And together we were asking the following question: can a financial innovation help smallholder farmers become more productive and climate resilient? Specifically, in 2009, just before we started the initiative, only 24% of farmers in the cooperative had access to water storage tanks, despite this being a dry area. An innovative asset collateralized lending, or ACL program, was introduced by the cooperative in 2010. And where traditional loans offered by this and many other cooperatives required farmers to fully guarantee their loans with their own savings or by other community members, ACL loans replaced the full guarantor requirement with a security deposit covering only 25% of the loan, with the asset, in this case the water tank itself, covering the remaining 75%. Much like using a house as the underlying collateral when taking out a mortgage. And so ACL loans to purchase 5,000-liter water tanks were offered to more than 4,000 dairy farmers by the cooperative over several years. And we assessed the impact of this using a randomized controlled trial, with some farmers offered the traditional full guarantor loans and some farmers offered the ACL loans. And so what we found was that the ACL loans increased demand for water tanks by 10 to 20-fold, a huge increase, and repayment rates were very high, making this a financially sustainable model. In 2023, 71% of farmers had access to these large water tanks. Our randomized controlled trial also finds that the water tank increased monthly milk sales by more than 20%. It reduced fetching water time by 20%, and there's also some evidence that it improved school enrollment for girls. The findings were shared and published in a reputable scientific journal. And so you may ask, given the success, the publication, did the program scale? The answer is yes, but the answer is also importantly no. The yes part is that the Sacco and Dairy Cooperative continued the program by themselves after this pilot and provided an additional more than 4,000 loans since 2015, and also expanded the products beyond tanks to, for example, chaff cutters. But initially, it was not scaled beyond the cooperative, which raises the question, is there potential to scale it further? The answer is sure. There are tens of thousands of farmer cooperatives across Africa with millions of members, with many savings and credit cooperatives active in financial intermediation, agricultural produce, marketing, and processing. Yet the market does not by itself scale this initiative despite the positive scientific findings for people and planet. So what does it take to unlock much more financing for such ACL loans across Kenya, across the continent? It likely takes a collective push. First, it takes such cooperatives changing the terms of the lending to allow for ACL loans. And this, in some cases, may require changes in financial regulations. Second, it probably requires grants by public sector or private philanthropy to support awareness-raising campaigns to other cooperatives to share these findings, and it may require further support to their professionalization of these cooperatives. And it may require an ecosystem of financial intermediaries and impact investors that provide additional lending. In other words, taken together, it takes institutional innovation, it takes an integrated approach and partnership. And led by colleagues at the University of Chicago, we are now trying to scale this work and welcome partners. Let me give a second example from Uganda. So there, in another randomized controlled trial, in 120 communities in Uganda, we worked closely with several NGOs, the government of Uganda, and UNEP, and we found that the voluntary payment for environmental services scheme among small private forest holders reduced deforestation by nearly half and was a very cost-effective way to reduce carbon emissions and support the smallholders. These findings were initially published in 2017 in a paper called Cash for Carbon, and we've done long-term follow-up since. We find in this long-term follow-up 6 years later, after the program ended, that there's no lasting shift in resource-sharing practices. Moreover, we also find that landowners in former payment for environmental services villages exhibit more egalitarian social preferences than landowners in comparison villages. So again, the question can be asked, did this cost-effective program get scaled by itself? And again, the answer is no. It ended after 2 years of funding and was discontinued. Could it scale in sustainable ways? Like the ACL loan example, sure. But again, we need to develop new policies, legal rules, and governance mechanisms. We need institutional innovations that will unlock financial resources to pay for these schemes in ways that support inclusion and the planet. And so to illustrate, There's much discussion today, also here at the UNCCD COP, about the potential of voluntary carbon markets, VCMs, for such PES schemes. A new report just launched this week by UNU INRA in Accra, Ghana, called Carbon Market Economies, crafting a new narrative of opportunity and sustainable growth for climate action in Africa, shows that African carbon markets represent 16% of the global market, indicating their growth potential. These voluntary carbon markets in Africa have grown at a rate of 36% annually over the last 5 years, and the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative aims to unlock $6 billion in revenue by 2030. However, the risks are also great and increasingly known. For example, voluntary carbon payment schemes risk creating competition for land where commercial interests to pursue these payments lead to land grabbing, pushing out smallholders. Or unequal power structures leave smallholder forest owners with a very small share of the payments, with most going to middlemen. And in a recent Nature Communications study, researchers at Kyoto University show that a large group of multinational companies rely on low-quality credits to offset their carbon emissions. The study also found that many companies deliberately target cheap offsets, most of which come from projects implemented a decade or more ago. And so this indicates that most companies spending on offsetting their carbon emissions has failed to drive new investments in climate mitigation, let alone benefit local communities. As a result of these risks and practices, many other private funders will be reluctant to finance such schemes. However, provided the public sector takes its responsibility to alter the rules, institutional innovations can unlock those financial resources. In my own country, the Netherlands, we've seen, for example, a rise in nature cooperatives. These are communities of farmers that collectively organize to maintain nature or prevent degradations, and who collectively negotiate with the government, with the provinces, to receive payments for these. Already more than 10,000 Dutch farmers are involved. Voluntary carbon markets in Africa could similarly be modeled, with legal requirements in place to ensure minimum standards, preferential treatment for such cooperative initiatives, and clear transparency and reporting requirements on the side of cooperatives. Adequate governance provides companies with the security that their money reaches smallholders and generates environmental benefits. And to avoid a race to the bottom, countries will also need to collectively agree on such standards. Additional action by domestic and international public sector or private philanthropy is likely needed to support cooperatives strengthen their capacity. And some co-financing may be needed beyond payments from the voluntary carbon market, particularly when initiatives provide a range of social and environmental benefits, of which carbon offsets are only one. In short, these types of PES schemes, just like the previous example of asset-based collateral lending for water storage, can be scaled in ways that promote sustainability and equity goals, but an integrated approach, institutional innovation, and partnership across sectors and across the value chain is needed to unlock that financing. So in conclusion, the financial sector's influence on the interaction between human endeavor and nature is gaining recognition. What can we learn from these two examples when it comes to financing sustainable transitions, achieving ultimately, as some call it, transformative investments? The financial sector is both contributing and exposed to nature degradation. It perpetuates nature-damaging activities through its capital allocation and incentive frameworks, while the resulting Earth system disruptions expose it, and thus the rest of society, to systemic physical and transition risks. Given its resources, power, and unique position within society, the financial sector can, however, potentially be converted into a powerful agent of transformation for the most vulnerable people and the planet. The examples illustrate the importance of scientific evidence from impact evaluations, the importance of institutional innovation, putting in place the right policies and structures, nationally and internationally, and seeing finance not in isolation, but an integral part of a bigger system across multiple stakeholders, with the public sector an important role to play, not only in terms of providing finance, but also setting and enforcing the rules that benefit nature and smallholders. And importantly, transformation starts and ends with the land and the very people depending on its health. After all, money needs to follow true value. Thank you very much.